Welcome to What to Watch Wednesdays, hosted by someone's favorite film buff, Nathan. I love movies and I want to share that with you. From old originals to cult classics and foreign favorites, along with straight up drivel, WWW is your place for all things movies. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. 88.1 The Burg, your movie central. Welcome to What to Watch Wednesdays. My name is Nathan, the host of What to Watch Wednesdays, the show where we talk about 3 movies all in the same night. And for tonight's episode, we're talking about weird movies that nobody's heard of yet again. Yet again, I'm doing weird stuff yet again. We're going weird, and I'm going to keep this episode kind of short because it's that weird. So, buckle in. The movies we're taking a look at tonight are a part of the Fantômas trilogy, and before we get into exactly what that is, let me just go through the 3 movies on the watch list. The first movie is Fantômas from 1964, followed by Fantômas Unleashed from 1965, and ending out with Fantômas vs. Scotland Yard from 1967. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, you may be asking the very reasonable question, Nathan, what is this? Why do you always pick weird stuff that nobody's heard of? What are we talking about? Well, let me clear it up for you. So, Fantômas, the trilogy of movies, is a series of French comedy crime movies. They follow a criminal by the name of Fantômas, right? Now, here's the thing. I said that they're French comedy crime movies. Interestingly enough, if you Google Fantômas and just check out the Wikipedia page like I've done randomly for some reason multiple years ago that inspired me to talk about the trilogy, the point is, if you look up Fantômas right now, you'll find out that he is a well-known sort of career criminal from French literature that originated back in the 1910s. And keep in mind this trilogy is from the 60s. So it's kind of an interesting sort of crossover. And again, it's my perfect brand of weird because for some reason I Googled Fantômas a long time ago after hearing his name mentioned in somewhere or another, I don't even remember where, and decided to talk about the trilogy of movies that he had from the 60s. So because of that, that's what we're going to do when we get back from the break. Stick around and we'll jump into the original Fantômas. 88.1 The Burg, your movie central. Welcome back to What to Watch Wednesdays. And for our first movie on the watch list tonight, we will be taking a look at Fantômas from 1964, available to watch now on Tubi. For the basic plot summary of Fantômas, we follow a character by the name of Fandor. Sounds suspiciously, like Fantômas. But anyways, we follow Fandor, a reporter, and Commissioner Jouve, as they must work to catch Fantômas, a master of disguise. So, that's the plot summary, but that doesn't really tell you what on earth this is, and doesn't really explain the name all that much, and despite my quick summary of it, it doesn't really give you a lot to go off of. So I'm going to try to give just a little bit before we get into the movie itself. Like I said in the intro, I looked up Fantômas for some reason a couple years ago, and I don't know, I bookmarked it because it sounded interesting. Essentially, Fantômas is a criminal who is very ruthless and was kind of in a lot of books. It's kind of like it's almost like, imagine a Sherlock Holmes story, but instead of Sherlock Holmes doing a bunch of cases, it's the criminal doing a bunch of crimes, right? So the biggest thing I can say is that both Fandor and Commissioner Jouve are characters that show up in the original novels, Fandor being the reporter and Commissioner Jouve being the commissioner, right? They're both in the original novels. They're in the original stories. They're attached to the original idea of Fantômas. But when it comes to the 1960s trilogy, they basically wanted to take these classic stories and sort of remake them and kind of stray away from the original ideas, which were a bit darker and a bit more serious and kind of pulpy, sort of serial-based stories, and make them into these kind of silly comedies instead. And that's exactly what they did. And in order to kind of get that point across, they open up the movie with Fantômas burgling a bunch of jewelry and managing to bamboozle the clerk. And essentially, having not seen the movies themselves, but having seen a lot of clips, the biggest comparison I can make between Fantômas is the Pink Panther series with Peter Sellers, directed by Blake Edwards. If you've ever heard of the Pink Panther series, you know Inspector Clouseau, played by Peter Sellers. He's got this fake French accent, and he's kind of a bumbling moron, and he just falls over himself, right? That kind of comedic slapsticks tone, but done with actual French accents, because it's actual French being spoken in the movie, with kind of a more focus on the criminal rather than the commissioner or the inspector, right? So think of it like that. And if you approach it with that in mind, you will find that if you've seen the Pink Panther series, I'm sure you might have a different opinion, but from my perspective, having grown up on a lot of clips from the movies, I really enjoy Fantômas from 1964. I think it's well worth your time. It's very, very entertaining and quite funny. Part of it comes down to, again, initial impressions. First impressions are very important when it comes to movies, and they're important when it comes to a lot of other things, but movies especially. So when that has a good opening, you know the movie's going to be good for the rest of it, for the next 5 minutes at the very least, after that first impression. But it also has some really fun cinematography that I personally really like. It's got a really strong palette and use of some very creative and well put together production design that meshes well with that cinematography. Essentially, the palette is kind of washed out and flat, but it still feels cartoony and pulpy in all the right ways. And we've got this kind of jazzy elevator music that goes alongside a very nice main theme for the character of Fantômas himself, which kind of switches between this almost as iconic as the Pink Panther theme, sort of, I guess, jazz fusion type of a thing, and heavy playing of organs. If I sound a bit disorganized, that's because I sound a bit sick, and I'm not sick. It's just getting to my head a little bit. So apologies if I'm a bit all over the place tonight. But essentially, what I'm trying to get at is, personally, from a production and from a quality standpoint, I really enjoyed Fantômas, and I really think the comparison to the Pink Panther movies is apt and accurate. I think the biggest thing that stands out for Fantômas is how much it doesn't stand out. And by that, I mean it's certainly got high quality elements, but none of them are so blow you out of the water, knock you off your seat, amazing, right? The movie as an overall kind of product just functions rather than stands out above the crowd. I'm sure it doesn't excel over the Pink Panther series, but I would say it functions enough to be just on the same overall quality level. Because of that, I don't really fault it for just functioning. If anything, I call into question, why do we fault movies for just functioning? If it's entertaining, why does it matter? It doesn't matter is the answer to that question. It really doesn't matter. It's entertaining and it functions. So no real complaints. I can just happily recommend that you watch it if you're into slapstick comedies like the Pink Panther series. I honestly could say that. I think the biggest thing that's funny about this is that I've mentioned the comparisons to Pink Panther so many times, despite not having seen most of the Pink Panther movies. And I also haven't even mentioned the fact that the main character, Fantômas, or the titular character, Fantômas, is known for being a master of disguise. Whenever he takes off the masks of the people he's pretending to be, he's just got a blue mask underneath. He's just a blue face at the end of the day. His main character trait in these movies is having a blue face. It's not his real face, but the face underneath the blue mask is never revealed. So in reality, it looks like he has a blue face. I don't know how I've gone this long without mentioning it, because it's the most entertaining part to me. I can just say that it's Pink Panther with a blue guy, and that to me is really, really funny. I will also mention, before we go to break, that the most interesting part of the original Fantômas is that Fantômas is played by the same actor who plays our actual main character, the reporter Fandor, who's trying to capture Fantômas. And keep in mind, I like to point out when things don't work. And it took me until the second movie to realize the issues with having one actor play both the protagonist and the titular antagonist of the movie. But we'll save that for when we come back from the break. We're going to go to a music break, and when we come back, we'll jump into Fantômas Unleashed. Stick around. 88.1 The Burg, your movie central. Welcome back to What to Watch Wednesdays. And for our second movie on the watch list tonight, we will be taking a look at Fantômas Unleashed from 1965, available to watch now on Tubi. For the basic plot summary of Fantômas Unleashed, we pick up 1 year later after the original Fantômas movie from 1964, as Fantômas kidnaps a high-ranking scientist. Now we must follow Fandor and Juve as they must protect the co-worker of this kidnapped scientist at all cost from being kidnapped by Fantômas. So, that's again just the basic plot summary. Let's get into the movie itself. First off, the movie starts off very strong. I was sitting there thinking to myself, wow, this is about the same quality as the first movie. It's going to be pretty entertaining. We're going to get some interesting stuff going on, and I'm really excited for it. Let's see where this goes. And the more the movie went on, the more it started to lose me. I'll be completely honest. For the first bit there, I'm pretty engaged and very much locked into watching it. And near the end there, I'm kind of tapering off and losing a lot of interest. Again, just speaking fully honestly, from my own perspective, I think this movie, in comparison to the first, suffers a little bit from having the same issues as the first movie, but not being of the same quality to the point where you start to notice the flaws a lot more. That's always kind of a problem when it comes to sequels, is usually when the first movie's good or entertaining or interesting enough, you tend to overlook the flaws, but when the movie that follows it isn't as interesting or entertaining or of the same quality, you start to notice the flaws that it has, and then you start to realize, hang on a second, these same flaws were present in the first movie, and I just didn't notice it until now, because the first movie was so entertaining. My brain just kind of skipped over the analytical side and was more so entertained and enjoying it. And I think the biggest example of that comes down to the cast and the characters, right? One thing I mentioned near the end of the first movie's review is the fact that the character of Fandor, this journalist who is very dedicated to finding Fantômas and even spreads lies about him in the newspapers and is essentially always blaming the latest kind of craze or the latest scoop on Fantômas, is the same actor who plays Fantômas, right? And here's why that becomes an issue. Because this is from 1965, we don't have the ability to have this sort of shot, reverse shot ability for Fantômas and Fandor to fight each other. Because this isn't from the 90s where we had the Austin Powers series. And yet, here's my biggest issue. You could still have done that because Fantômas is just a guy with a blue mask. In reality, they could have done it. They could have used a stunt double to have Fandor and Fantômas fight directly one-on-one. Instead, they play around with the idea of Fandor and Fantômas never being seen on screen together in any direct way. And I'll tell you why that's a problem. It's a problem because every time they get into conflict with each other, it ends up with Fandor just fighting Fantômas' henchmen rather than him fighting Fantômas directly. And it leads to most of those encounters just resulting in Fantômas standing around yelling at his henchmen and not doing a whole lot. And because they can never be seen on screen or even in relation to each other at all, they just end up having this issue where Fandor does a lot more than Fantômas, and Fantômas doesn't do a whole lot, and even then Fandor doesn't do a whole lot. So it's just kind of this whole issue wherein both of them just kind of suffer for it, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because if I'm being honest, why did you have the same actor play both characters? Especially in the first movie, when you have a moment where Fantômas disguises himself as Fandor. See, it's convenient for that moment when the actor playing Fandor is also playing Fantômas because he's not disguising himself. He's just taking off the blue mask to look like himself. But then that becomes a problem of why is he taking off the blue mask? I thought his blue mask was his whole personality trait, right? And keep in mind, I noticed all of these things while watching the second movie. I didn't notice them while watching the first movie. My brain completely glossed over it when watching the first movie because it was that entertaining. But when the same things start to happen in the second movie, and you start to notice that Fandor's just fighting the henchmen and Fantômas is just standing around doing a whole lot of nothing during the action sequences and is really doing a whole lot of nothing in general. He's not threatening people. He's just kind of kidnapping and then standing around going, aha, I've kidnapped you. I'm now going to go do something else. You start to notice, hang on, he has presence, but he's not doing a whole lot. Needless to say, what I think I'm getting at is for a movie called Fantômas Unleashed, he seems pretty much on the leash the entire time and isn't really the highlight of these movies, to be honest with you, which is kind of unfortunate when it's called the Fantômas Trilogy. You'd kind of hope that the main villain, the character that has existed since the 1910s, that is now in this 1960s trilogy, would be the main focus and the big highlight, and he's just not. I will say, however, when it comes to entertainment value and major selling points, there is a saving grace, and that saving grace is Commissioner Jouve. Let me tell you, I briefly mentioned it in the first movie, not even that much when I was reviewing it, but by the time the second movie rolled around, I noticed almost directly that Commissioner Jouve is the most hilarious part of these movies. He is extremely animated, extremely angry, and extremely all over the place all the time, and it is really funny. If you're going to watch these movies, which I would recommend watching the first two for sure, watch them so you can see Commissioner Jouve be funny. And I promise you, you're going to find him funny. He's just grumbly, short, and really dedicated to catching Fantômas, but is also really in his own way about being able to catch Fantômas at nearly every turn. And because of that, it just turns into this infinite comedy. In the first movie, there were genuinely laugh out loud moments with him. In the second movie, he's kind of the only entertaining part, especially a part where he gets thrown in an insane asylum. You can imagine where that goes, but I'm not going to spoil too much of that part. What I can basically say is that rather unfortunately, while Fantômas is not the highlight of these movies, they at least have Commissioner Jouve going for them. And that's kind of an unfortunate reality because while the first two are definitely worth watching in my opinion, or maybe not definitely, but I'd recommend the first two, it kind of becomes an issue when we get into the third movie and you start to realize that maybe Commissioner Jouve is the only thing these movies had going for them. But that'd be getting ahead of myself, and I don't want to get too ahead of myself. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll jump into Fantômas versus Scotland Yard. Stick around. 88 won the Burg, your movie central. Welcome back to What to Watch Wednesdays. And for our third and final movie on the watch list tonight, we will be taking a look at Fantômas versus Scotland Yard from 1967, available to watch now on Tubi. For the basic plot summary of Fantômas versus Scotland Yard, we pick up 1 year later, again, after the events of Fantômas Unleashed, where we follow Fantômas, yet again, as he begins enforcing a tax on the rich of Scotland. I know I just said that completely normally, so let me repeat that. Fantômas begins taxing the rich. He begins taxing the rich people for their right to live. He gives them payment plans. He gives them a month deadline. He gives them an amount that they're supposed to pay in tax to him. The masked bandit Fantômas himself has truly become one of the most horrifying villains in all of fiction by deciding to charge people taxes. What? Huh? What's that? What did you just say? Yeah, that's right. Non-existent audience member who just asked a very valid question. They just asked to me, is that the real plot summary? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. This movie follows a masked blue man walking up to rich people and saying, give me this amount of money in a month. This is a tax. He says it directly. He says it as a tax directly. Okay, I gotta move on. This is ridiculous. This is insane. This is what? I've seen ridiculous stuff in my time, but I don't think I've ever seen a masked bandit from 1910s French literature decide to tax people. I don't think I've ever seen that. That's definitely a first on the bingo card. Square it away. Get out the stamper, Grandma. We're going to bingo night. We just hit the jackpot. Okay, I'm going to move on before I lose my mind. So, let's just say this much. When it comes to this idea, I have issues, of course, if you couldn't tell. But what I have bigger issues with is the quality of the movie itself. See, here's the thing I haven't really mentioned with the Fantômas trilogy. I mentioned that the visuals and the production design and the palette and the music are all pretty good, and they are. And they're still good for this third movie. Here's the issue. I haven't mentioned the sound quality. The sound quality for these movies is not the best. And at first, I excused the original movie for not having the best sound quality because it was still serviceable. It still got the job done. And I kind of gave it props on the basis of, well, it's from the 60s. Audio technology wasn't amazing back in the 60s compared to how we have it today. It wasn't even that good back in the 80s. Compared to what we have today, the audio quality can be excused. When I watched the third movie, I stopped excusing it. Let's just put it frankly like that. When the movie opens up with bagpipes, one of the most notoriously harsh-sounding instruments of all time, and that's a matter of my own opinion, but it's also just like, listen, even if you think the bagpipes are a beautiful instrument, you got to admit they're loud and shrill at best. And so when they blare over this not good sound quality, you kind of start to notice, I think the sound quality isn't very good. I'm kind of starting to notice that it's a bit grating at times, and it's not exactly matching up to these beautiful visuals. One thing I've mentioned multiple times on this show and has been told to me over and over again over the course of my film career is that good audio can save bad visuals. Good visuals cannot save bad audio. Now, here's the thing. When it comes to the 60s, I'm more lenient with that idea because audio was not great. They did not have the capacity to make as good of audio as we can today. However, I can still maintain the idea that there is a threshold. There's a threshold for how bad of audio quality I'm willing to put up with before I start pointing it out and realizing that when a movie looks this good from the 60s, the audio quality not matching becomes an issue. And Fantômas versus Scotland Yard, and to be honest, even the original Fantômas, kind of reaches that threshold and then steps over the line. That's the honest truth of it all. I think I'm well justified in saying all of that. Now that we've gotten that off my chest, I think the biggest issue with this movie is the fact that the story is not there. I don't know how it's not there, considering it's a movie about a bandit taxing the rich, but, you know, I'm not really all that surprised, to be completely honest. I found out that the story wasn't that good, and it doesn't really progress like the other two movies. See, here's what the first two Fantômas movies did really well. They managed to kind of just go on entertainment value alone and ignore the fact that their stories weren't the strongest. Even the original movie at a certain point tended to kind of have a downward trend where they started to focus on the plot a bit too much and it started to collapse in on itself, but it managed to pick itself back up by the end. The second movie also has a somewhat similar problem and it suffers a little more for it, but I'm able to forgive it. This one has no excuse. It should have learned from the other two that it shouldn't have focused on plot. And instead it focuses exclusively on plot. And here's what I'm going to say about the plot. When you have this overwhelming idea of Fantômas taxing the rich, and you open it with Fantômas saying, Don't tell anybody that I'm taxing you guys, otherwise your lives will be in danger. You have the basis of what I'd like to call a mystery. Actually, no, I correct myself here and yet again. It's not a mystery, it's a bad mystery, because we as the audience have been told in the opening scene that Fantômas is taxing the rich, and the rich people are being told that they cannot share that information with anybody. But that becomes an issue later on when Fandor and Juve and everybody else show up, and they go, why is Fantômas attacking the rich people? What's going on? What's the big secret that we're not being told? When the audience knows every single aspect of the secret and the main characters do not, it's not much of a mystery. And it's not much of a chase when Fantômas doesn't really do a whole lot. I will admit he does more in this movie than he has in the last two. But even then, it's not that much. And so because of that, it turns into a, well, we're just kind of stagnant, aren't we? Because we know what's going on, the characters don't, and we're waiting for them to catch up. And there's not going to be a big twist, because we already know what's going on. And somehow they still manage to boggle that up. I can't even get into the specifics of that, or we'll be losing our minds as equally. I want to be the one carrying the burden of losing my mind, and I don't want to put that too much on the audience. So here's what I'll narrow it down to instead. The thing about the Fantômas trilogy as a whole, and something that is very apparent by the third movie, is that as entertainment value with Commissioner Juve, and with the presence generated by Fantômas rather than his actions as a character, you are in for a very enjoyable ride. I would still recommend the first two at the very least, and I'd say the third one could be something to throw on if you've got nothing better to do. Here's the thing, they're not good as background, because they are at least entertaining enough for you to want to actively watch them. But if you try to actively watch them too much, rather than just having them on as mindless entertainment, they're not going to be enough to keep you engaged with coherent plot lines or with well-executed plot lines. It's kind of this awful middle ground where you're not engaged enough by the plot and the characters, but you are entertained by all of it. And again, Juve's the biggest entertainment factor draw for sure. He's, again, really funny. So on that basis, I'd recommend them so you could see Juve be funny. But at the same time, I'd imagine that you could get the same entertainment value out of watching either the Pink Panther series or the James Bond movies. I mean, these movies were made in response to the Pink Panther movies and the James Bond movies. So on the one hand, you've got that. But here's the thing. Here's the general question I want to ask you. Did the Pink Panther movies or the James Bond movies have a blue guy? No, they don't. No, they don't. So, on the very basis of Blue Man, I'd recommend the Fantômas trilogy. I definitely had fun with them, and I'll at least admit that they're mediocre, but I will not ever be convinced that the blue guy is not funny and Juve is not entertaining as all get out. So, with all that being said, thank you all for listening in to What to Watch Wednesdays tonight. I will be back next Wednesday from 8 to 9 p.m. here on 88.1 The Burg. If you want to follow along with What to Watch Wednesdays, please be sure to follow along on YouTube and Instagram at What to Watch Wednesdays, all one word, no caps, no spaces. And again, I'll be on next Wednesday telling you all what to watch, hopefully not being super clogged up. Good night, everybody.